So I've written this book with my friend, colleague, co-conspirator, Geronimo Barrera de la Torre, who works currently in the USA, but does most of his research in southern Mexico, in Oaxaca, province with indigenous campesinos there. I, on the other hand, work in urban UK contexts, predominantly working class communities, but not exclusively. And as good geographers, our relationships with those places have shaped our book. I'll touch on a little bit later. We're also, it's deliberately expansive study. As good anarchists, I think we're concerned with authority, broadly speaking, and we're particularly focusing in on the state as the sine qua non of authoritarian relationships, not authoritarian states specifically. That's a slightly different category as we've been talking about today, but authoritarianism as a relationship, a relationship between any state and subject from an anarchist perspective. But as perhaps not very good anarchists, we don't ask, why is the state a bad thing? What's wrong with the state? What should we do instead necessarily? We ask a slightly different question to start with our book. What if the state had never existed? Okay. How would we act? How would we think? How, I should say might rather than would, how might we imagine our world differently and our place in it differently as well? And this isn't just a hypothetical question, although it sort of started off in our minds as one, and it spiraled into oblivion. But actually counterfactual thinking, as we might call it, has inspired huge amounts of intellectual development over the years, and also grounded kind of political action. So we might think about kind of a great example being utopian science fiction. Kim Stanley Robinson, Ursula Le Guin, and so on. And this thought experiment, like I said, has led us down a very deep rabbit hole. But we've been working on these kind of ideas for a decade or more. And this book is a sort of a first step into building out from some kind of papers and journal articles that we were working on for many years. So the state is so central to dominant ways of seeing the world. Not everyone's ways of seeing the world, but dominant ways of seeing the world, especially among those in positions of power and the institutions that they people. But if it had never existed and was only one idea among many of kind of how to organise polities and societies, it wouldn't hold that central power. So really what we're trying to do in the book is decenter the state from its position as the pivot around which geographical and political imaginations orbit. At the same time, sort of this mysterious symbolic power of the state actually is very grounded and material. It's absolutely undeniable. We can't just magic away by thinking about it in a kind of Foucauldian governmentality way, or whatever it might be. And despite its sort of repeated shortcomings, some might say failings, broken promises, and sometimes quite unspeakable violence against often its own citizens, why does the state have that magnetism? Why do we keep coming back for more? So we're not asking in our book a definitional question, what is the state? Or even a kind of necessarily a normative question of why should we get rid of it, or why should we do something different? But we're thinking about it from the perspective of logics, okay? These kind of repeated rationalities and repertoires of order and ordering and in fact bordering, if we want to be geographical about it, that produce stateness. Okay, so we think about the state not as a set of institutional structures or relationships, but as the outcome of certain patterns of relating over time. A regime of sorts, a way of being of sorts, that includes state institutions, but also significantly exceeds them as well. So we're moving away from studying the state as this kind of institutional actor and into the logical foundations of what we call statism. Statism is a term that kind of the so-called libertarian right has really run with has a very strong tradition of talking about statism. We're kind of trying to wrestle that back to the kind of the libertarian left, as it were. So we're looking at statism, statist logics of order, ways of being, in the widest possible range of political, obviously, but also cultural, social, and indeed cosmological frames. Okay, so in the book, we draw from archaeology, we draw from Morris dancing, my particular interest there, civic virtue, farming, utopian fiction, the English Civil War, weaving, all kinds of things like that. Okay, because we're thinking in a deliberately expansive way. Because we argue that statism's particular set of operational logics are expressed, codified, or undermined, resisted, surpassed, evaded, and so on, in many different contexts, not just on that interface between the state on the one hand and subject on the other. It's also linked to a few more disciplinary specific bugbears that we as geographers have, as geographers and kind of anarchist-inflected geographers. And we kind of have five main sort of pillars of those, what we call myths of the state, that are assumptions that underlie a great deal of scholarship, certainly in geography and our kind of neighbouring disciplines as well, I think. First of all, that the state is neutral, that it's an empty container into which ideologically charged governments or parties or whatever are inserted and can be removed. Secondly, that it's natural, that it's just kind of an assumed outgrowth of human development. That is just a part of perhaps population density or resource scarcity or what have you. All these kind of things that have actually been disproved by an awful lot of archaeologists and anthropologists over the years. Third, that it's a permanent, eternal, unchanging fact of life. It's here, we've got to deal with it. Okay. On the contrary, the state was created in very specific circumstances by very specific groups of people. States come and go, they have beginnings and ends, and are continually evolving, which I'm sure political scientists you all know about anyway, but states die, and geographers don't really think about that very much. Fourthly, that the state is somehow the pinnacle of human societal development, that we've always been headed towards this teleological point of the liberal, particularly the liberal democratic state, certainly in the Western perspective of things. That teleology we talk about in quite a lot of detail is again a huge assumption, and in many regards, certainly over the long durée of complex human societies, is incorrect, or at least a minority. The state is young, it's an anomaly. Okay, and thinking in those terms suddenly sort of makes you think, wow, okay, all kinds of other things open up in front of you. And then fifth kind of main pillar of these myths of the state is that the state is the only alternative lever of power that stands in the way of global capitalism. Okay, so if you're a kind of a critical or radical scholar, the state's the only thing we have to sort of regulate or minimise, or perhaps in some cases, eliminate market capitalism. Obviously, this ignores the role of the state in actually instituting that same economic system, and negates the autonomous power of social movements, I think, in undertaking non-state responses to capitalist exploitation, such as labour movements, for example, often bypassing the state and having non-state effects, because they know it will always ultimately side with capital. So we found lots of otherwise critical, radical scholars assuming these rather uncritical, unradical things. So one of the really key driving points through our book is about knowledge, epistemology, and that's really central to our project. And we argue that, and I'll quote, certain regimes of knowledge are expressions of and factors contributing to the operations of state power. In other words, and we're talking to geographers here, our analytical imprecision isn't just an unfortunate effect of state power that it just sort of tumbles out of us because we're just a passive reflection of kind of this structure above us, but actually it is productive and constitutive of that state power. So it's not something we passively receive. We're active makers of state logics when we make the kind of assumptions and claims to knowledge in these terms. So we wanted to explore how to think differently, how to surpass or perhaps transcend statist logics in our thinking and perhaps also our acting. I should caveat the book by saying we only, maybe less than a quarter of the book is dedicated to that. What do we do instead? Because it is such an enormous and complex question that I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. But if prevailing knowledge regimes sort of produce state effects, then it's not enough just to be against the state, sort of simplistically, we don't like it. Because that sort of reproduces its centrality in our knowledge systems. And we need to be thinking and acting beyond and despite it in some way. Hence the despite in the title of our book, Society Despite the State. This is obviously much harder than it sounds. But perhaps crucially, while rather than finding a singular sort of epistemic framework that is the answer for knowing the state otherwise, for surpassing it, for overcoming it perhaps, we argue that an approach that confronts this singular sovereign authority of the state's knowledge regime is actually founded on perhaps epistemic plurality. And we explore this through three overlapping themes of nature, time, and order. And I won't go into huge amounts of detail about that right now, but maybe we'll pick up on some of it. So what do we think about in response to this? In many regards, this is a sort of an entry point. We kept on joking about coming up with whole chapters that we wanted to write about, and we were like, that's for volume 2. Just put that to one side. Well, you've got to create boundaries somehow around these book projects, otherwise they become these kind of multiple volume monsters that Victorians used to like writing. One of my favourite geographers, Elise Reclus, he wrote a 15-volume thing called the New Universal Geography, which was supposed to encompass everything about geography. Bless him, he didn't quite manage it, but it looks really beautiful on the shelf. So anyway, sorry. Key propositions, really. I'll just pick out on one of them. We make a number of suggestions, possible ways forward. Most of this is very much sort of looser kind of horizons. Some of these are perhaps a bit more actionable in concrete terms. But we try to sort of keep grounded as theorists as much as we can as theorists in the social movements and struggles that we're both individually and collectively involved in. And what we're trying to do is draw together multiple threads from different contexts, focusing on this epistemic plurality that we're trying to explore, which we call radical pluriverse. So drawing on the kind of Latin American school of decolonial thought, we think about a radical pluriverse that might constitute what we call an anti-authoritarian family of worldviews and cosmovisions, and that operate on fundamentally different logics to statism, and thereby find affinity with each other. And affinity is a crucial word. Rather than unity, this constant academic and in fact political search for like ideological or theoretical perfection, for unity, simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny in the real world. So affinity is a term that we're trying to push forward as a technique of finding common ground without pretending that there are really fundamental structural differences in terms of geographical context, in terms of global political economy, and so on. And a unifying dimension of these diverse perspectives, these affinities we're looking for, is what we broadly call the cosmopolitics of disregard. And that sounds like a rather fancy term. But it actually, well, I'll just break it down for a couple of minutes, is that okay?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
First of all, cosmopolitics, for those of you who don't know, drawn from the work of Isabel Stengers, who's written about how certain forms of science come to dominate our interpretation of science in general. We take cosmopolitics in a bit more broad kind of sense of the term to mean the ways that the cosmos, the ordering of the universe, is made political. And one of the things that I think Western leftists, very broad brushstroke, struggle with is the idea of faith, of spirituality, of the immaterial and of the irrational world. Those worlds that many people feel very closely to and are very connected to. There's a strong kind of sense that, strict secularity is what we must be aiming for, and anything other than that is somehow backward, in quote unquote. So essentially we want to expand our political gaze beyond the material realm to this wider vision that incorporates the immaterial, the so-called irrational, and the so-called mythical. So people talk about political myths as some kind of bad thing, this kind of, fascism, for example, was built on a mythology and therefore it's a bad thing. No, fascism is a bad thing because it was a bad thing. Right? The mythology is separate to that. It used mythology very effectively, but we're saying let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater in that sense. And then disregard. Disregard rather than ignoring or pretending the state doesn't exist. Disregard is a consciousness of that thing that you're disregarding, but a deliberate disinterestedness in it, okay? Holding it at arm's length. And this is a sort of a logic or rationality of action in relation to the state that we talk about. So it might involve calculated, disinterested, and instrumental engagement with state structures, and maybe this is something that kind of overlaps with what Lara was talking about, to pursue our own autonomous goals, collective goals. It might involve navigation or bending of those structures. It might involve transversal organisation within the state itself, or disengagement from or even attack of those structures when it's harmful or not useful. Okay, so disregard is something that many people do in relation to the state on an individual level. We've got in the UK, there's a general election coming up. Huge proportion of people won't even bother voting and will be quite comfortable with that and say, that is a decision I've made, I'm not voting. And then a very large number of the people who do vote will vote for the least worst option. Okay? And that is a very conscious engagement with the political system. And I think voter abstention is something that people assume means, they don't care. They don't care about what happens. Of course, people care. It's a deliberate and conscious decision not to bother. Okay? And that tells us something. But disregard can also become a form of a strategy of devaluing or decentering the state. Not passively ignoring state power. Not many of us have a privilege of being able to ignore state power, but consciously and collectively devaluing it and decentering it. Okay. So ultimately, we might not all want to abolish the state. In fact, most people in this room don't. But its centrality in how we look at the world and our place in it, we argue in the book, severely limits our political imaginations, especially in this context of uncertain times. So I'll probably stop there.
Fantastic, thank you very much.